All right, welcome everybody. In this video, we are going to be talking about tips and best practices to share with the commercial side of the real estate industry, specifically on how to negotiate commercial leases in the times of COVID. I'm happy to be joined here today by attorney Cole Young. Cole is a commercial real estate business attorney here in Boston, where we are located. And I think these tips, though, are applicable to basically every commercial lease in the nation right now, whether it's a restaurant, an office, some type of retail space. Cole, can you tell us a little bit about what's going on in the space right now and how you're seeing all the different various commercial tenants negotiating or trying to negotiate with their landlords?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks for having me. I always love these conversations because I'm a real nerd and I genuinely like talking about this. So I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure. That being said, it's been challenging for commercial tenants and landlords alike. And there's kind of two ways to look at this, Jeff. So there are current deals, right? So, and there's actually, I'm shocked. So I thought for sure that commercial real estate would sort of dry up during COVID. And I don't know if you thought the same or what you saw sort of on the residential side, but everybody kept kind of warning me every deal is going to stop and kind of go away while we figure out COVID. And fortunately, I've seen that not happen. So the good news is what I'm seeing with kind of new deals is that new deals are still going forward, even for restaurants. I have a couple of active restaurant leases that I'm working on right now, which seems kind of, crazy when other restaurants are closing down. But the thought is by the time we get it built out, hopefully we'll have a vaccine or we'll have a new protocol, whatever it is. But those deals are going forward. I actually have a gym, another one that you wouldn't expect, right? That gyms are sort of closed and on pause. But those deals that are currently going on are still going forward. So that's what I'm seeing. However, what I'm also seeing in the active deals is that there's just a lot more pause. So in the old days, last year, because commercial real estate was so hot, what you would see is a commercial landlord saying, look, you have to sign now. I've got 15 other potential tenants backed up waiting to come in, right? So I would get a lease as a commercial real estate attorney, and I'd almost get calls immediately saying, Cole, we've got to turn this. Because there's a whole bunch of other people lining up. Probably what you would see on the residential side, right? You need to make an offer on this house. I have 10 other offers coming in. What's happening now, though, is we're slowing it down. So we're saying, yes, we want to get in the space, but we know that there's not 10 other tenants lined up. We know that we can slow this down. And so what's happening is deals are going forward. They're just going forward a little slower. So that's on the new deal side. On the existing deal, and this is what I've been spending probably the last couple months working on, Jeff, is either renegotiating or trying to negotiate down an existing commercial lease. And this is happening throughout the country, East Coast to West Coast. And if just a quick Google search, you'll see that different states are handling it in different ways. You've probably seen too that some of these big tenants, I think it was Cheesecake Factory recently filed for bankruptcy. Brooks Brothers, one of my favorites, has filed. And there's a few other big, what would be normally either anchor tenants or big tenants in commercial settings where they're completely collapsing, or they're going back to their landlords and saying, we have to work a deal.
I read an article earlier this week that Manhattan is claiming to be one of the worst places to do business right now to have retail, because not only is there no commuters going to and from wherever they go all the time, but there's no tourism also. So you could have a storefront, but you're barely getting anyone walking by, let alone walking into a store. And I think that in the residential space, it's a lot clearer because most people watching this video are more familiar on the residential side, where there's a lot of things happening in the shadows. You've got a lot of tenants that are not making their rent payments on time, and that's been increasingly getting worse as time has gone on. You've got a lot of homeowners who are in forbearance, which means they've negotiated with their bank to allow them to stop temporarily paying their mortgages. And when you turn it back to the commercial side, and I'm speculating here because you're the expert on the commercial side, but I think there's a lot of stuff happening in the shadows on the commercial end as well. You've got a lot of commercial tenants that just aren't paying rent. They can't get evicted. It's not really in the interest of the landlord to evict them, because who are they going to replace them with? As you just mentioned, there's not a bunch of tenants lined up at the door waiting to sign a new lease. So it's interesting your new deals makes perfect sense because uh, this will not last forever. And commercial deals typically take a while to put together. They take a while to build out. And by the time everything's done, hopefully the timing will be right where there's a vaccine or at least more uh, therapies to speed up the recovery and have a higher chance of success on that side. Um, how is it working though with tenants who want to get out of their leases? They've got another 2 years on their lease. They're in a tough spot to negotiate.
It can be. So, and it's everything's a little nuanced. So if that happens, here's what I would say, and I would almost answer it with more questions, and that is, if you're a tenant and you've got a couple more years left and you just can't function this way. I'm going to ask you questions like, who is on the lease? So is it an entity or a person? Is there a personal guarantee? And how much security deposit or build out do you have into the space? So if you think about this, Jeff, if you and I are renting an apartment, it's kind of a quick analysis of, I need to break this lease and here's sort of what it's going to cost. If I'm running a restaurant or a laboratory facility or something I've put money, real money into the space, I have to do some calculations as the tenant saying, okay, not only am I walking away from this, but I'm walking away from millions of dollars that I may have put into the space. So Mike, if you came to me and said, Cole, I need to break this lease, I'm going to say, all right, Jeff, one, how much money do you have into it? How much money are you losing right now? And sort of doing this cost benefit analysis of, does it actually make sense to break? And usually it does not, assuming that you've put money into the space. Now, if you're like me, if you're a simple office user as a lawyer, I haven't put money into my space. I mean, it's very generic office, right? So if I needed to break my lease, I would have a conversation with the landlord that would probably be relatively simple. But I have restaurants who have put in $2, $3, $5 million worth of money into space, and the landlord's holding on to 6 months worth of security deposit. And to simply walk away from that, it's the question you asked was more of a legal question. I'm giving you kind of a business approach, which is, how much money am I really losing if I walk away? So what I would suggest is, instead of breaking, what we've been doing the last month or two is going back to these landlords and saying, I'm either going to break, I'm either going to walk away, and there's not much you can do about it right now. I think we talked about this before, Jeff, that at least here in Massachusetts, the governor just extended the moratorium on evictions until October 17th. So what that means, and it also applies to many commercial spaces as well, that means that I, sitting in a commercial space, I still owe the rent, but the landlord can't really do anything until October. And even in October, courts are going to be, I mean, I almost want to sit outside of every courthouse in the Commonwealth and see there's going to be lines out the door, right? So with that in mind, I've been going back to these landlords and saying, we don't want to break, but we can't pay what we're currently paying. And so if I may, what I'd like to do is give you kind of a quick, here's what I've been doing, here's what's been working, here's what hasn't been working and I'm looking at this from a tenant going to a landlord. And if you're an agent or a broker that represents the landlord, you sort of expect that this is what a tenant is likely going to ask. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
So the first, maybe the obvious, and people are going, hey, Cole, thanks for the obvious here. But the first is rent. And so what I usually come in asking for immediately to a landlord is saying, look, I don't want to break. I don't want to sit here and hold up the space and play the game where I keep you your arms tied until October, or whatever state you're in. There's moratoriums all over the place. So what I need you to do is lower my rent. Just flat out, we go from $10,000 to $5,000 a month. And the reason I'm pitching that to you, landlord, is you're not going to have somebody else to come into the space. You're going to be stuck with me for several months. So even though it's kind of a big ask, right, to go from my example of $10,000 to $5,000, well, it's better than nothing. So we've often led with that. I need to just flat out reduce. And if the landlord doesn't accept that, then what we try to do, and I don't know if you're familiar with, in commercial leasing, you pay rent, and then you also typically pay what's called CAM. And everybody uses that a little bit differently, but you pay insurance, you pay maintenance, you pay common area maintenance charges. I had to think about what the acronym was, but it's the piece that goes in addition to rent. So what I will tell a landlord is, first, please give me a break on rent. I want a full reduction. If that doesn't work, I say, okay, can I get a reduction in CAM? You're over your expenses. This is kind of two ways of playing the same issue. But sometimes for landlords, it comes out of different buckets. And I know I'm getting into the weeds here, but if your landlord is a big landlord, like a REIT or an investment fund, they have certain obligations to their investors who actually might, for whatever reason, be more comfortable waiving or giving you a discount on rent or CAM, but not both. So ask for both. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
The other pieces that I'm working on, or taking that free rent or the free CAM, is putting that on the end of a lease. So I have, in the last month, I have several restaurants actually, but what we would call fast casual, which is known as fast food. Years ago, I think we've rebranded it, right? It sounds a little healthier. Uh, so several.
There's a lot of restaurants that have popped up though that actually have healthier versions that are fast and casual. But I get your point.
All of my clients serve nothing but the best. So, but right. A lot of these fast casual places are saying we've had to completely stop. So I just told you, ask for free rent, ask for an abatement of CAM. What they have done, what I've seen a lot in that space, is the landlord will say, okay, you've got some PPP money, you've got to give me a month or 2 months of that. I will give you a month or 2 months free, but we're going to tack it on either at the end of your lease, so I'm going to extend it another couple months, or I'm going to amortize it over the lease. So if I was an agent, so say you're a real estate agent, you represent a restaurant or you represent a business, and they come to you and say, they're not, we've already gone and asked for free rent, they're not giving it to us. What I would do as an agent is go back and try to work with the landlord's broker or the landlord directly and say, we're willing to stay in this space, but what I need you to do is take that money. So my client's effectively going to pay it. It's just not going to be paid right now. So either bake it into the lease going forward. If there's 5 years left, you bake it in every month and it turns out to be a very nominal amount of money, or we extend the end of the term and pay it that way. I'll tell you from my experience what I've seen. So I told you the fast casual folks are doing a lot of this. Landlords are willing to put it at the end, Jeff, but not a lot of money, because they don't want to say, okay, don't pay rent for the next year. We'll add it on in 2025. They know they're likely never going to see that money. So what they're doing is saying, we'll give you 3 to 6 months of free rent, but we're going to start charging you back right when you start paying. So, kind of amortizing it or tacking it on midway. And then the last thing that I'm seeing, or actually there's two last things I'm seeing. One is percentage rent. So if you're a restaurant, you often pay a percentage of sales. The funny part about that is there are no sales. So the landlord's not getting anything right now, right? So you pay a certain amount over what you sold in either alcohol or food, or sometimes both. What I had a client do something really clever that I thought I really loved. And that is, they said to a landlord, reduce our rent, our base rent, until we hit the percentage rent. And once we hit the percentage rent, we'll kind of start back to where we were in the past. And what that did, hopefully, is it's going to give my client the ability to stave off some of the big losses now, but then show the landlord that once we get back up to that original level, we're going to be able to pay you full rent again. It was kind of this like natural barrier or natural indicator of where things would get better. And then to kind of wrap this all up, nobody knows what's going on, right? And so I've already had several leases that have been amended and changed that I've had clients recently call, like today, saying, hey, Cole, these terms were great a month ago, but we're having a heat wave in Boston and nobody's coming to the restaurant or nobody's coming to the retail or whatever it is that's opened up. We need to renegotiate. So a lot of these deals are being done to say, we have a deal now, but we're going to have to agree to come back at the end of the year and see what happens.
Who's the best party to be negotiating on behalf of the tenant, and who, in your opinion, is the best party to be negotiating on the other side? I mean, should all commercial tenants go to their attorneys to negotiate? Is that standard practice? Should they be calling really a real estate broker? Should they just be directly communicating with the landlord? Or what's your best advice for the flow of communication?
That's a great question. So I would actually say that it depends on the relationship. So if you have a really good relationship with your broker, or I'm sorry, with your landlord, and you haven't involved a broker in the past, I would go directly to the landlord. If you've worked with a broker or an agent in the past, that's who I would make the communications through. So even though as a lawyer, I want everybody to call me, you actually want to bring me in once the conversation has already started. So you just ask, and I would say that it's the same on both sides of the equation. So if you're the tenant or the landlord and you've worked with brokers or agents in the past, I would go back to those brokers and agents and have them fire the first couple of shots. Because think about this, Jeff, they're the ones that see what's happening in the market. I just got a report from a big brokerage yesterday about vacancy rates in and around Boston. And I mean, they were in the single digits last year, and they're no longer in the single digits. So what I would do, having a lawyer come in and make that pitch isn't to me as persuasive as having a broker or an agent come in and say, hey, I've got 5 other properties that this is happening to, landlord. You better, we better negotiate. And then, and this is where I'm making a pitch for myself or really any other lawyer, then you have to get an attorney involved, because I've seen one too many times, Jeff, where these landlords and tenants kind of come up with these deals and they're a handshake or an email and it doesn't actually get memorialized. And then you find out that that's not what they meant, or worse, your client agreed to something that really nobody knows what's happening, and we're all kind of back to square one. So sorry, that's a long way of saying, if you have a good relationship, landlord to tenant directly, if there's brokers involved, use them, utilize them. And then once you get everything ironed out, you've got to come to a lawyer to make sure it's done right.
Are there any other clauses in a commercial lease? Commercial leases are very complicated when you compare them to a residential lease, which may only be 1 or 2 pages.
Yeah.
Are there any other clauses in a commercial lease that tenants should be looking out for when they're renegotiating beyond just a rent reduction or the payment terms of that rent?
I mean, call me. Everything. There's also, I honestly, I wouldn't say that there's one. There's probably 5 or 6 that are critical for either renewing or getting in initially. What everybody's talking about right now, Jeff, I think you and I've talked about this before, are force majeure clauses. And this is what everybody's sort of been Googling lately to figure out, can they get out of their lease? And I think it's kind of a red herring. I think a lot of folks, tenants and landlords alike, have kind of paid the most attention to that. So I've had clients recently say, hey, Cole, we looked at, to your point, it's a very complicated lease. We read it all and we're really paying attention to the force majeure clause. That's basically means if something happens like a pandemic or, God forbid, a war or natural disaster, things sort of get suspended. But in commercial leasing, Jeff, it doesn't matter. Rent is still due, and it's almost not even worth negotiating most of the time. So I would suggest that the things that were important before are still important now. And if you want to get a little throwaway for force majeure, you can.
What's the biggest mistake that you've seen tenants make in the process of negotiating or trying to renegotiate with their landlords, where you've had to get involved because they missed a certain term or something was missed, right? Lawyers always get involved when things get hairy, and hopefully they're proactive with their clients and they're able to help them through early on, but some of them still might do direct tenant to landlord conversations and then make a mistake. So what's the biggest mistake you've seen?
So it's actually, and this is kind of broader, the biggest mistake I still see, and I've always seen, are logistical items. So forget about what I can do all of the indemnification, all the boring legal language that you hire a lawyer for. The mistake I always see, Jeff, is the landlord says to a tenant, we do X, Y, and Z. Let's use something simple. We shovel the snow, or we pay for the water bill, something kind of innocuous. And that doesn't get its way into a lease. So the biggest mistake I always see and I always hear is, well, I talked to the landlord. I talked to Bob, the landlord's super, and Bob said that they were shoveling the snow and it's not included in the lease. And this may sound like a small piece, but when you're dealing with larger buildings, particularly in inner cities or large cities, they're really, really large dollar items. So HVAC, for example, air conditioning, heating and cooling is wildly expensive, and you need to know who's fixing that and who's maintaining it. So that's by far the biggest mistake I see is there's some talk between the parties, then a lease gets signed. Somebody didn't ask, hey, should we put this in the lease? It doesn't get in there, and now the landlord or the tenant can kind of say whatever they want. So this is where I'm always kind of hammering my skills, is I try to ask the questions as a tenant, not just as the lawyer. So who is managing the HVAC? Who is doing the snow removal? How does parking work? What if I need to get access to the roof? All of these questions that I, as a tenant, am operating under, you got to ask them, and then they have to get they put into the lease itself.
Okay. Well, Cole, I think that was a great overview on some best practices and tips for negotiating and renegotiating commercial leases. Cole Young is an attorney here in Boston, where we are, and Cole's also one of our instructors. You teach some really great intro to commercial real estate courses if you're interested in getting into commercial real estate, or if you're already a licensed real estate professional and want to learn a little bit more about what it means to operate as a licensee on the commercial side of the business. Visit us, keepmecertified.com. We have some great courses for you. Cole, it was great to have you and speak with you. Stay well, and we look forward to seeing you in one of our courses, and another one of our upcoming courses soon.
Thanks, Jeff. I love these. I really appreciate it.
Bye.
All right. Take care.